The Wanderer's Return. The late autumn sun cast long shadows across the makeshift wooden gates of Haven Settlement, where children gathered daily to watch for travelers along the old highway. Most days brought nothing but wind-blown debris and the occasional wild dog, but today was different. Today, they saw him first. The Tomato Man's silhouette appeared on the horizon like a memory come to life. The children had grown up hearing stories about him, the wanderer who brought hope in the form of seeds, knowledge, and news from distant settlements. His approach was unmistakable, the pronounced limp, the metal staff that served as both walking aid and weapon, and the cart pulled by his faithful companion, a strange mule-like creature with fuzzy ears and patient eyes. "Look! Look!" whispered 8-year-old Sarah, her finger pointing through a gap in the wooden palisade. "Just like in the stories." The other children crowded around her, their faces pressed against the weathered planks. They watched in fascination as the figure drew closer, his tattered cloak billowing in the wind, revealing glimpses of the mysterious hump on his back. The cart behind him creaked with each turn of its mismatched wheels, loaded with covered crates and sealed barrels. Simon, Clifford's eldest son at 12, stood slightly apart from the younger children. He remembered the last time the Tomato Man had visited, though he'd been too young to form proper memories. His mother had been deathly ill after giving birth to him, and the settlement had feared losing both mother and child. The story said it was the Tomato Man's medicines that saved them both. The wanderer paused at the outer marker, 100 paces from the gate. He reached into his cart and retrieved a small jar, its contents gleaming red in the sunlight. The children couldn't contain their excitement any longer. They burst through the side gate, rushing toward him with the reckless abandon of youth. "Hello, hello, young ones," the Tomato Man called out, his voice warm despite its raspy edge. His face was weathered like old leather, creased with countless miles and stories, but his eyes sparkled with genuine joy at seeing the children. He held out the jar, his hand trembling slightly with the effort. The smallest child, barely 5 years old, reached for it first. "Are you really him?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. "The one who brings the red fruit?" The Tomato Man chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "Indeed I am, little one. And what's your name?" "I'm Lucy," she declared proudly. "Mama says you saved her when she was sick, back when Simon was born." She pointed at the older boy, who stood a few steps back, studying the stranger with cautious curiosity. Recognition flickered across the Tomato Man's face. "Ah, young Simon. Clifford's boy." He straightened slightly, leaning on his staff. "You were just a babe when I last saw you. How is your mother?" "She's well," Simon replied, standing taller. "I have 3 sisters now." The Tomato Man's smile widened, revealing gaps where teeth had been. "Strong blood, indeed. Your father chose well." He turned to the cart and pulled back one of the covers, revealing rows of carefully packed jars. "Would you children like to try something special? Something from very far away?" The children gathered closer as he retrieved a different jar, this one filled with a strange, red jelly. "This," he said with theatrical flourish, "comes from across the Great Salt, where people have learned to make sweetness from seaweed and berries that grow nowhere else in the world." As the children dipped their fingers into the offering, savoring the unusual treat, Simon studied the cart more carefully. There were markings on some of the crates he'd never seen before, symbols that looked like waves and stars, arranged in patterns that seemed to mean something. "I should get my father," Simon said suddenly, remembering his duties. "He'll want to know you're here." The Tomato Man nodded, but his hand shot out with surprising speed to catch Simon's shoulder. "Tell me, boy, before you go, how many other traders have come through? What news of the eastern routes?" Simon shook his head. "None since spring, and they only came from as far as the old city ruins. They said the eastern routes were too dangerous, monsters in the deep woods." Something flickered in the old man's eyes, concern, perhaps, or calculation. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Give this to your father before you tell anyone else I'm here. He'll understand. Simon took the package, feeling its negligible weight. He nodded solemnly, understanding that this was important, even if he didn't know why. As he turned to run back to the settlement, he heard the Tomato Man begin telling the younger children a story about seas that glowed at night and fish that could speak in human tongues. The boy clutched the package tightly as he ran, his mind racing with questions. Why did the Tomato Man want his father to see this before announcing his arrival? What were those strange symbols on the crates? And why did the old wanderer seem different this time, more urgent, perhaps, or worried? The settlement had changed since the Tomato Man's last visit. The original handful of survivors had grown into a community of nearly 100. The makeshift shelters had been replaced with proper buildings, some even sporting glass windows salvaged from the ruins. Gardens flourished behind protective walls, and a small herd of goats grazed in a nearby field. Simon found his father in the council hall, discussing the winter preparations with other settlement leaders. When Clifford saw his son's expression and the package in his hands, he immediately called for a break. Taking the package, he unwrapped it carefully, revealing a simple piece of paper with those same wave-like symbols Simon had seen on the crates. Clifford's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disbelief, and something Simon couldn't quite name. "Where is he?" his father asked, his voice tight with emotion. "At the outer marker, with the little ones," Simon replied. "He has a cart full of goods, and there's something different about him, Dad." He asked about traders and the eastern routes. Clifford was already moving, calling out to specific people as he went. "Susan, start the cooking fires. Martha, gather the scribes. Thomas, check our storage cellars." He paused only long enough to grip his son's shoulder. "You did well, Simon. Very well. Now, go help your mother prepare the house. We'll be having an important guest tonight." As Simon watched his father stride purposefully toward the gate, he couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous was about to happen. The Tomato Man hadn't just brought goods this time, he'd brought news that would change everything. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. From the direction of the gate, Simon could hear children's laughter mixing with the creaking of cart wheels and the murmur of adult voices. The Tomato Man had returned to Haven Settlement, and with him came mysteries and possibilities that would reshape their world in ways none of them could yet imagine. Seeds of the past. The firelight danced across the walls of Clifford's home, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move in rhythm with the Tomato Man's voice. He sat in the old leather chair, his twisted frame somehow looking both fragile and formidable in the warm glow. The children had been sent to bed, but Simon had been allowed to stay, perched on the stairs, officially too far to hear but close enough to catch every word. Before the fall, the Tomato Man began, his gnarled fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of Susan's homegrown tea. "I was just Thomas Redfield, assistant curator at the Global Seed Vault." He paused, studying the liquid in his cup as if reading memories in its surface. Not that titles meant anything after everything changed. Clifford leaned forward in his chair, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've never spoken of the before times, Tom. Not in all your visits. Because before today, the knowing of it wouldn't have helped anyone." The old man shifted, and his hump, which Simon could now see was actually a carefully concealed backpack built into his cloak, creaked with the movement. "But things are different now. The sea people have changed everything." The adults in the room exchanged glances. Martha, the settlement's chief scribe, dipped her quill in ink, ready to record every word. The Tomato Man had always brought seeds, medicines, and news of other settlements, but never before had he spoken of his own past. "The vault was supposed to be humanity's insurance policy," he continued. "Seeds from every corner of the world, preserved in case of global catastrophe. When the networks went down and the cities started burning, we thought we were ready. We were wrong." He took a slow sip of tea, his hand trembling slightly. The vault's location became public knowledge somehow. Everyone wanted what we had. Nations, armies, desperate people, they all came. We tried to protect it, to maintain order, but... He gestured at his twisted leg. That's when I got this. Caught in the crossfire when the last defenders fell. Susan gasped softly, but the Tomato Man raised his hand. No, no, don't pity me. That injury saved my life. While I was lying there, unable to move, I watched them destroy themselves fighting over the vault's contents. By the time the smoke cleared, I was one of 3 survivors, trapped under rubble with nothing but a maintenance pack of backup samples. Simon shifted on his step, trying to get a better view. His father had told him that the Tomato Man was important, but he'd never imagined this. The old wanderer wasn't just a trader, he was a keeper of humanity's agricultural heritage. The other survivors? Clifford started to ask. Dead within the first year, the Tomato Man replied flatly. The radiation from the fighting was worse than we thought. But I had something they didn't, knowledge. Not just of the seeds, but of how to protect them, preserve them, make them grow in hostile conditions. He reached into his cloak and withdrew a small book, its pages yellow with age. This was my life's work before the fall, studying how to modify crops to survive in extreme conditions. When everything collapsed, I realized that knowledge was worth more than gold. Martha's quill scratched frantically across her parchment as the Tomato Man continued. I started walking. First south, then east, following the old roads. Everywhere I went, I found pockets of survivors. Some had food but no clean water. Others had water but couldn't grow crops in the changed soil. Each place taught me something new, and in return, I shared what I knew. He paused, running his fingers over the book's worn cover. That's how I earned this name you all use. In those early years, tomatoes were my greatest success. They could grow almost anywhere with the right care, rich in nutrients, easy to preserve. People started looking for me, spreading word of the man who could make food grow in dead earth. Clifford nodded slowly. I remember when you first came here. We were eating nothing but scavenged cans and whatever we could hunt. That first crop of tomatoes. His voice cracked slightly. It gave us hope. Hope, the Tomato Man echoed, is what I've tried to plant everywhere I go. But hope needs more than just seeds to grow. It needs knowledge, connection, trade. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. That's why what I've found matters so much. The sea people, they've developed new ways of growing food, new methods of purifying water. They've built something remarkable. Simon couldn't contain himself any longer. But where did they come from? He called down from his perch. Why hasn't anyone found them before? The adults turned, startled by his voice, but the Tomato Man just smiled. Ah, young Simon. Always asking the right questions. He shifted in his chair to face the stairs. They were submariners, crew members from deep-sea research vessels who survived the fall by staying underwater. While the rest of us fought over land and resources, they learned to farm the sea itself. He reached into his humpback and withdrew a glass jar filled with what looked like purple seaweed. This is just one example. They call it night bloom. It grows in complete darkness, needs no soil, and contains more nutrients than any land vegetable I've ever seen. Clifford stood up and began pacing. But why reveal this now? Why not in your previous visits? The Tomato Man's expression grew serious. Because the world is changing again. The radiation zones are shifting. Old routes are becoming dangerous while new ones open up. The sea people have offered something unprecedented. They want to establish permanent trade relations with land settlements. But they'll only deal with communities they trust. He pulled out the paper with wave-like symbols that Simon had delivered earlier. This is their language, their way of marking safe trading partners. They gave me these markers to distribute to settlements I vouched for personally. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Haven Settlement wasn't just being offered trade, they were being offered a place in a new network of surviving communities, a chance to be part of something larger than themselves. "There's more," the Tomato Man said, his voice growing urgent. "The sea people have ships, real, working vessels. They've been mapping the coastlines, finding other survivors we never knew existed. They believe it's time for humanity to start rebuilding properly, to stop just surviving and start living again." Martha's quill had stopped moving. She stared at the Tomato Man with wide eyes. "How many other settlements know about this?" "So far. 3 others. Carefully chosen, like Haven." He looked around the room. "I've spent 20 years walking the roads, learning who can be trusted, who has the strength and wisdom to handle what's coming. You're all part of something bigger now, if you want to be." Simon watched his father sink back into his chair, looking overwhelmed. The Tomato Man reached out and patted Clifford's knee with his gnarled hand. "I know it's a lot to take in. But remember, every great forest starts with a single seed. 20 years ago, I gave you tomatoes. Today, I'm offering you the world." As the adults began discussing logistics and possibilities, Simon slipped away to his bed. His mind was racing with visions of vast underwater cities and ships sailing to unknown shores. The Tomato Man hadn't just brought news this time, he'd brought a future none of them had dared to imagine. But as he drifted off to sleep, Simon couldn't help wondering about the dangers the old wanderer hadn't mentioned, the threats that might be lurking in the shadows of this bright new future. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ask about the eastern routes again, and this time, he wouldn't let the subject drop so easily. The Sea People. Dawn broke over Haven Settlement with an unusual buzz of activity. Word of the Tomato Man's revelations had spread through the community like wildfire, and no one could sleep past sunrise. Simon found himself helping unload the mysterious cart, each crate and barrel now carrying new significance as he recognized the wave-like symbols marking their origins. "Careful with that one," the Tomato Man called out as Simon and 2 other boys approached a large sealed container. "It's their water purification system. More valuable than gold." The container took all 3 boys to lift, and as they carried it toward the council hall, Simon noticed something odd. The bottom was warm to the touch, and he could hear a faint humming sound. Living technology, something beyond the scavenged ruins they usually traded in. Inside the council hall, Martha had transformed one wall into a massive map, marking known settlements with red dots and suspected radiation zones with dark shadows. The Tomato Man stood before it, using his staff to trace lines between points. "The Sea People call themselves the Nautilus Coalition," he explained to the gathered council members. "They have 3 main hub cities along the coast, here, here, and here." His staff tapped points far out in the ocean. Each one was built around an old research station or oil platform, expanded over the years using materials salvaged from sunken cities. Clifford stepped forward, studying the locations. "Those are hundreds of miles apart. How do they maintain contact?" The Tomato Man smiled. "Submarines. Small ones, mostly, converted to run on something they call biofuel, processed from the same seaweed they grow for food. But they also have larger vessels for trade and exploration." Simon, having finished helping with the cargo, sat cross-legged near the map, absorbing every detail. The Tomato Man noticed his interest and waved him closer. "You see these currents marked in blue? The Nautilus people have mapped them all, learned to use them for transport. They can move goods faster than any land route, and most raiders don't even know they exist." "But why haven't we seen them before?" Simon asked. "Surely someone must have spotted their ships." The old man's face grew serious. "They've been watching us for years, learning which communities might be trusted. Remember those monsters in the deep woods that kept traders away from the eastern routes? Some of those stories were deliberate, ways to protect their landing sites from the wrong kind of attention." A murmur ran through the council members. The Tomato Man raised his hand for silence. Before anyone feels deceived, understand their caution. They have technologies and knowledge that could help rebuild civilization, or destroy what's left of it in the wrong hands. He reached into his ever-present humpback and withdrew what looked like a piece of glass. As he held it up, images appeared on its surface, clear, moving pictures like the old world screens, but without any power source Simon could see. "This is Nautilus Prime," the Tomato Man said as images of an extraordinary structure appeared. Multiple levels of interconnected platforms rose from the sea, their surfaces covered in vast greenhouses. Wind turbines spun lazily above while strange mechanical arms dipped into the water below. Home to over 5,000 people. The council hall erupted in gasps and exclamations. 5,000 was more people than Simon had thought still existed in the entire world. They survived the fall by going deep, the Tomato Man continued. While radiation and war ravaged the surface, they used their underwater capabilities to explore, salvage, and build. They preserved not just people, but knowledge, science, medicine, agriculture. They've spent 20 years perfecting ways to grow food in the most hostile conditions imaginable. Martha stepped forward, her scribe's instincts taking over. But why reach out now? Why change their policy of isolation? The Tomato Man's expression darkened. Because they've discovered something that affects us all. The ocean currents are changing, shifting in ways their scientists don't fully understand. Some of their farming stations have already been disrupted. They believe it's another aftereffect of the fall, and if they're right, it will eventually impact everyone, sea and land alike. He turned back to the map, pointing to various locations. They need inland partners, stable communities that can help establish new supply lines and trading posts. Places where they can build hybrid facilities that combine their sea farming techniques with traditional agriculture. Clifford rubbed his chin thoughtfully. And they chose us. Haven isn't exactly a major settlement. No, the Tomato Man agreed, but you have something more valuable than size. You have stability, knowledge, and most importantly, you've preserved something many other settlements have lost, the ability to trust and work together. He walked to one of the newly delivered crates and opened it, revealing rows of strange devices. These are just samples of what they're offering. Water purifiers that can clean radiation-tainted water. Seeds engineered to grow in half the time with double the yield. Medicine that can cure diseases we thought were death sentences after the fall. Simon watched as his father picked up one of the devices, turning it over in his hands with a mixture of awe and concern. And what do they want in return? Land partners, the Tomato Man replied. Communities that can help them establish a presence above the waves. They need places to build secure trading posts, warehouses, research stations. And they need people they can trust to help run them. He paused, looking around the room. But there's more. They want to start teaching again, sharing the knowledge they've preserved. They're looking for young people willing to learn their ways, to bridge the gap between sea and land. Simon felt his heart leap as several adults turned to look at him. The Tomato Man smiled, noticing the boy's reaction. Yes, Simon. They're particularly interested in the children who have grown up after the fall. Minds not bound by old ways of thinking. A commotion at the door interrupted them. One of the perimeter guards burst in, breathing heavily. Riders approaching from the east. At least 20, heavily armed. The Tomato Man moved with surprising speed for someone with a lame leg, hurrying to the window. His face showed no surprise, only grim confirmation. Right on schedule, he muttered. You knew they were coming? Clifford demanded. I suspected they might. Raiders have been following my trail for months, ever since rumors of the sea people started spreading. He turned to face the council. This is your first test. How you handle what's coming will determine whether the Nautilus Coalition moves forward with Haven as a partner. Simon watched his father's face harden with determination. We've dealt with raiders before. Not like these, the Tomato Man warned. They're organized, well-equipped. They're not looking for food or supplies, they're hunting for technology, for knowledge of the sea people. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a small metal cylinder. This is another gift from our friends in the deep. Consider it a demonstration of their commitment to protecting their allies. As the warning horns began to sound throughout Haven settlement, Simon realized that everything was about to change. The simple trading post his people had built was about to become something else entirely, a bridge between two worlds, a key point in humanity's slow climb back from the brink. The Tomato Man caught his eye and winked. Ready for a real adventure, young man? Because this is just the beginning. Trading routes. The metal cylinder in the Tomato Man's hand hummed to life, emitting a soft blue glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. Simon watched in fascination as the old wanderer hobbled to Haven's highest point, his legendary limp forgotten in the urgency of the moment. When I activate this, he explained to Clifford and the other defenders who followed, it will send a signal. Help is closer than you think. His weathered face cracked into a knowing smile. Did you really believe I've been walking these routes alone all these years? Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching horses filled the air. The raiders appeared on the horizon, their vehicles a mix of horses and hybrid machines that burned the last reserves of ancient fuel. Their leader, a towering figure in cobbled-together military gear, raised a megaphone to his mouth. "We know you're harboring the Seed King," the voice boomed across the settlement. "Surrender him and his seafolk trinkets, and we'll leave your little farming commune in peace." The Tomato Man's expression darkened. Seed King? Well, that's a new one. He turned to Simon, who had refused to take shelter with the other children. They've been following me for months, gathering fragments of stories, building their own myths. Amazing how quickly legends grow in this new world. Clifford gripped his rifle tighter. Our walls are strong, but against 20 armed raiders. We won't be fighting alone, the Tomato Man interrupted, twisting the cylinder's base. It emitted a high-pitched tone that made Simon's teeth ache. Watch the eastern shoreline. For a moment, nothing happened. The raiders began to advance, their weapons clearly visible now, a threatening mix of old-world firearms and newer, crude but effective implements of war. Then Simon saw it, a disturbance in the water of the distant bay, followed by several dark shapes breaking the surface. Right on time, the Tomato Man murmured. The shapes resolved into sleek vessels, unlike anything Simon had ever seen. They moved with impossible speed, skimming across the water's surface like water striders. As they reached the shore, panels opened to reveal crews in form-fitting suits that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. Nautilus Rapid Response Team, the Tomato Man explained proudly. They've been shadowing me ever since I left their city, keeping watch from the waterways. Part of our arrangement, they protect their investment, and I prove which settlements can be trusted by seeing how they handle situations like this. The raiders had noticed the new arrivals. Their neat formation broke apart as some turned to face the approaching sea people while others continued toward Haven's walls. Their leader's voice crackled again, "Stand down. We have you surrounded." The Tomato Man lifted the cylinder high, and its pulsing light shifted to a brilliant green. In response, the sea people's suits suddenly lit up with similar lights, creating a dazzling display that made them seem to multiply in the morning haze. "Last chance," the old man called out, his voice carrying surprising strength. "Leave now, or learn why the eastern routes have been closed to your kind." What happened next would be told and retold in Haven for generations. The sea people moved with coordinated precision, deploying devices that created walls of mist and sound. The raiders' horses panicked, their machines sputtered and died, and their formation dissolved into chaos. No blood was shed that day. It didn't need to be. The Nautilus team's technology proved more than sufficient to herd the raiders away from Haven, leaving behind several abandoned vehicles and dropped weapons as testament to their hasty retreat. As the defenders cheered, Simon noticed the Tomato Man watching the scene with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something else, sadness, perhaps, or worry. "They'll be back," the old wanderer said quietly. "Not these particular raiders, but others. The knowledge of what exists out there, what's possible, it spreads like ripples in a pond." Clifford nodded grimly. "Then we'll need to be ready." "Yes," the Tomato Man agreed, "but not just with weapons and walls." He gestured to the sea people, who were now approaching the settlement. "This is why the Nautilus Coalition has decided to surface, so to speak. The world is changing again. We need to build something new, a network of communities working together, sharing knowledge and resources." The next few hours were a blur of activity. The sea people, once their protective suits were removed, looked surprisingly normal, though their pale skin and large eyes hinted at generations spent in artificial light. They brought more supplies from their vessels, water purifiers, communication devices, and most importantly, plans. In the council hall, maps were spread out showing the proposed trading routes, a complex network of land and sea paths connecting surviving communities. Haven's position, it turned out, was crucial. "You sit at the intersection of 3 viable land routes," the Nautilus team's leader explained, her accent strange but understandable. "With access to both river and sea trading possibilities. We've been watching this settlement for years, seeing how you've grown, how you handle challenges." The Tomato Man smiled at Simon's surprised expression. "Did you think it was coincidence that I kept returning here? That I chose Haven to rest between my wanderings? I've been evaluating potential partners for the coalition since I first made contact with them 15 years ago." As the adults discussed logistics and security arrangements, Simon found himself drawn into conversation with one of the younger sea people, a girl about his age named Marina. She told him about growing up in the underwater city, about gardens that floated in pressurized bubbles beneath the waves, and about schools where children learned both the old world's knowledge and new ways of surviving. "We need to learn your ways too," she explained. "How to live on the land, how to grow food in open air. That's why they're going to build an exchange center here, a place where our people can learn from each other." The Tomato Man overheard and nodded approvingly. "That's the real purpose of all this," he said. "Not just trade, not just protection, but bringing together the different pieces of humanity that survived. Each group found their own way to live through the fall, now it's time to share those discoveries." As the day progressed, more details of the plan emerged. Haven would become one of several hybrid settlements, places where land and sea communities could interact safely. The sea people would help fortify the town's defenses and set up early warning systems against raiders. In return, Haven would become a training center for surface adaptation and land-based agriculture. "But what about you?" Simon asked the Tomato Man as evening approached. "Will you stop wandering now?" The old man laughed, patting his ever-present humpback. "Stop? No, young man. My work is more important than ever. There are other settlements out there, other potential partners. Someone needs to find them, evaluate them, bring them into the network." He winked at Simon. "Unless, of course, you'd like to learn the trade." New beginnings. 6 months had transformed Haven settlement beyond recognition. Where once stood simple wooden walls, now rose smooth barriers of some compound the sea people called oceancrete, stronger than ancient concrete and capable of generating solar power through its surface. The old watchtowers had been replaced by elegant spiral structures that served as both observation posts and vertical gardens, their surfaces covered with climbing vegetables and fruits. Simon stood at the top of the tallest tower, looking out over what the Nautilus people now called Havenport. The eastern shoreline had been completely reshaped, with a series of floating docks extending into the bay like fingers reaching for the horizon. 3 of their sleek vessels were currently moored there, their crews exchanging goods and knowledge with the settlement's residents. "Quite a view, isn't it?" The Tomato Man's voice came from behind him. Despite all the changes, the old wanderer looked the same as ever, twisted staff, mysterious hump, and legendary limp. But there was something different in his eyes now, a satisfaction that hadn't been there before. I thought you'd be gone by now, Simon said, turning to face him. It's been weeks since your last departure. The old man smiled, leaning on his staff. Had to come back for this day, didn't I? Not every day a settlement graduates from testing status to full coalition partnership. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a familiar glass tablet, its surface coming to life with shifting images. Besides, I heard someone here is ready to begin their own journey. Simon felt his face flush. He'd spent the past months splitting his time between learning from the sea people and studying the Tomato Man's techniques for evaluating settlements. His father had been surprisingly supportive of his interest, especially after seeing how the coalition's presence had strengthened Haven. Marina says I'm ready, Simon said, referring to his friend from the sea people who had become his primary instructor. She thinks I understand enough about both sides now to help find new partner settlements. Does she now? The Tomato Man's eyes twinkled. And what does young Marina plan to do while you're wandering the trade routes? She's been assigned as Haven's permanent coalition liaison, Simon replied, trying to sound professional despite his obvious pleasure at the arrangement. We'll be able to coordinate through the new communication network. The Tomato Man nodded approvingly. Good. Partnership works best when both sides have skin in the game. He turned to look out over the settlement. Your father told me about the latest harvest numbers. The hybrid growing techniques have tripled your yield. Below them, Haven buzzed with activity. The main square had been transformed into a teaching center, where sea people learned traditional farming methods while settlement residents studied hydroponics and aquaculture. Children played games that taught them both surface survival skills and underwater safety protocols. The sound of laughter mixed with the hum of coalition technology and the familiar noises of settlement life. We had 17 new families arrive last month, Simon reported. All vetted through the network. The coalitions helped us expand the living quarters using their building techniques, and Martha's started a proper school combining both knowledge bases. And the raiders? None since that first group. The coalition's defense network covers most of the region now. Even the independent settlements are starting to realize it's better to trade than raid. The Tomato Man reached into his ever-present humpback and withdrew a small package wrapped in oilcloth, similar to the one he'd given Simon to deliver to his father all those months ago. Speaking of trade. I have something for you. Simon unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a book, old, but well preserved. Its title read, Agricultural Adaptation in Extreme Environments. My original copy, the Tomato Man said softly. The one I carried out of the vault all those years ago. I've added my own notes over the years, observations about what works, what doesn't, which communities might be ready for contact. Simon stared at the book in shock. But, this is your life's work. Exactly. The old man smiled. And now it's time for new eyes to carry it forward. The world's changing again, Simon. The coalition's bringing back technologies we thought were lost forever, but they need people who understand the land, who can bridge the gap between the old world and the new. He reached into his pack again and pulled out a familiar metal cylinder, the signal device he'd used during the raider attack. Marina helped me modify this. It's linked to Haven's communication network now. If you run into trouble on the routes, help will never be far away. Simon took the cylinder, feeling its comfortable weight. When do you want me to start? There's a settlement 3 days east of here. Small place, but they've been sending out radio signals on the old frequencies. Coalition intelligence suggests they might be ready for contact. The Tomato Man grinned. Thought you might like to handle the evaluation. Marina's already prepared one of their short-range vessels to follow your route along the coast. A commotion from below drew their attention. The main gates were opening to admit a group of travelers, refugees from another failed settlement seeking Haven's sanctuary. Simon watched as settlement residents immediately moved to help them, offering food and water with the easy generosity of those who know they have enough to share. That's why we do this, you know, the Tomato Man said quietly. Not for the technology or the trade, but for moments like that. Every person who finds their way to safety, every child who grows up knowing there's more to the world than just survival, that's what makes the road worth walking. He straightened up, adjusting his pack. I'll be heading west tomorrow. There are rumors of another vault out there, and the coalition wants to know if anything survived. Might be gone for a while this time. Will you come back? Simon asked, suddenly feeling like a child again. The old man's smile was warm. Haven's home now, isn't it? Besides, someone needs to check on how their newest wandering trader is doing. He gestured toward the setting sun. You should get some rest. Tomorrow's a big day, lots of preparations if you're going to hit the eastern route by week's end. As they descended the tower together, Simon noticed something he'd never seen before, a small tag sewn into the Tomato Man's cloak, faded but still legible, T. Redfield, Global Seed Vault, Assistant Curator. You kept it all this time? He asked. Sometimes, the old man replied, you need to remember who you were to understand who you've become. He paused at the tower's base. The world ended, Simon, but it also began again. We just had to learn new ways to grow. That evening, as Haven's residents gathered for their communal meal, a tradition that now included both surface dwellers and sea people, Simon watched the Tomato Man share stories with the children, just as he had on his first visit. But now the stories weren't just tales of distant settlements and mysterious traders. They were blueprints for a future where humanity's scattered seeds could take root and flourish once again. Tomorrow, Simon would begin packing for his first solo journey. His father had already given him his mother's old compass, and Marina had provided him with coalition maps showing safe routes and potential contacts. But tonight, he simply listened to the old wanderer's tales, understanding at last that the most important seeds the Tomato Man had carried weren't the ones in his pack, they were the seeds of hope he'd planted in every heart along his endless road.